I'm a chartered town planner. I've worked in planning both on the mainland in enforcement and on the Isle of Wight in planning policy for about 25 years. And I work now as a consultant, so I work with developers. And really what I wanted to talk to you about was the developer perspective, because developers are often seen as the baddies in housing provision, and planners especially often seen as the baddies, either by communities where they're approving planning applications or where they're working as consultants submitting planning applications. So in 2018 and 2019, there were 350 houses completed on the island, and that is set against the government target of 520. So, and we've never ever met in the last 8 years the housing target of 520. The problem with that is that our housing, affordable housing, is all linked to, mostly linked to developers building housing schemes over 10 to have to provide housing on the site. And the problem, the biggest problem is that out of those 350, how many of those do you think were affordable housing for the last year? How many? I'll open it up. How many do you think, Nicole? How many affordable houses do you think were built last year?
50.
50? I'm not going to ask you because you'll know, Jeff. Yeah? 100? Anyone else? 12. None. None. No, not one single affordable house was built. And that's really shocking, isn't it? Because we see these houses being built and we think, well, at least there'll be some affordable housing. And there's 0. The year before there was 18. This year there might be 7. And I know that because I'm working on the scheme and I know that the developer has built 7, nearly finished them. So there will be at least 7. Isn't that sad that there's only that so few, that we are really not meeting the housing provision for our poor and our young families? And that's really bad, I think. And it's bad for planner, you know, for me too. I think it's wrong. And part of the bigger problem of it is because the government has decided that they want to have housing linked so closely as a tax on developers. And that means that people buying new houses are actually paying for these affordable houses. The developer isn't, I can guarantee you. They'll never ever spend anything themselves that they don't have to. So, you know, naught, a whole nothing. And what do you imagine the housing waiting or the housing need is? I won't start with you, Nicole, this time. What do you imagine the housing need is on the island?
For affordable housing?
Yep.
Maybe 700.
700, is that what you think?
2,000. Council houses we need.
So the actual figure is 200. There's actually 200 as a need each year. So obviously, every time we don't get anywhere near there, every time we have a 0, it's even worse because each year it's getting worse and worse and worse. And of course, what we've also got the problem is that our current housing stock, you know, the houses that are really not green need to be removed from the housing stock and need to be replaced. So out of the 350, I don't know actually how many of those houses are replacements, but very few will be. And that's a long-term problem for us as a society, that we're talking about climate emergencies and we're actually not providing housing in that meets the climate issues of today, let alone of the future, which will be much, much worse. So most of the buildings are concentrated in the larger villages and towns, and that's a good thing because it means that they are, you know, going to be more sustainable. They're going to support villages, they're going to support towns, and they will, you know, help them grow. Unfortunately, only 44% of those completions of houses was on brownfield land. The rest was on greenfield, and many of those are on agricultural fields, which obviously has a massive impact in the future. So really, my argument is, I think, that we need to remove affordable housing from making developers pay, and as society, we all have to pay and we have to find a much better way to provide affordable housing. Thank you.
Cool. So yeah. As Daniel said, my name's Joe Lever. I'm a councillor on Newport and Carisbrooke, formerly parish, now community council. I've been on that council since June, and I'm also the young person on this in this session. So I'm forgive me, I'm going to have a bit of a moan now about the current situation. So yeah, unlike Martha, I don't have any particular expertise on housing, but what I do have is my experience as a young person raising a family, whilst trying to save for a house under successive Conservative governments. So we've been saving, sometimes more seriously than others, for about the whole 6 years that we've been on the island now. We've still not got the deposit, but we're nearly there. And I think our situation, and I imagine many other situations relate to this, is broadly down to two aspects. Personal circumstance and expenditure, and the properties themselves, so price, the quality, suitability. So our personal circumstance, as I said, we've got a young family, I've got a young daughter, all the extra costs that come with that, so more money on food, clothes, everything else you can imagine. And for the past 2 years, we've almost been solely reliant on my own income. My partner doesn't work at the moment. She stays home and watches the child. And we've always thought about perhaps putting our daughter in nursery. However, the cost to do that would mean my partner would have to work solely just to have a break, which is, financially speaking, there's just little advantage to doing that. And we've also got little or no family around on the island. I come from the north, Blackpool, and all of our family are still up in Blackpool. So in terms of respite, we have no or little help from anybody. So not only is it a strain financially, it also takes a toll on your mental health as well. Our rent, so for the 6 years we've been on the island, we're currently living in a place that is the lowest our rent has been since being on the island, but it still makes up about 27% of my post-tax income. And this fits with findings by former Conservative Minister David Willetts in 2017, who found that 18 to 36-year-olds are typically spending over 33% of their post-tax income on rent, compared to 5 to 10% spent by their grandparents in the 60s and 70s. Another aspect, personally, is paying for a long and pricey commute. So partly my fault for moving to the Isle of Wight, probably. But don't blame me, it's a lovely place to live, and I wouldn't change it. But another finding from David Willett's study was that young people are also facing longer journeys to work, commuting for the equivalent of 72 hours a year more than their parents. I was, and still to some extent, a good example of this. So for the past 6 years, the first 2 years I worked in Havant, for 3 years after that I worked in Reading, and then for the past year I've worked in Chandler's Ford, just outside of Southampton. The commute to Reading was particularly bad, and it meant about at least 5 hours of the day was spent commuting. And then on top of that, you've also got the extortionate prices to pay to get off and then back onto the island as well. So the annual price for the ferry off, which again, financially takes a toll, and also on the mental health side of things. And then also, having been to university, repaying student loans, another chunk out of our monthly budget, and student debt has risen to over 120 billion from just under 25 billion in 2006. And in the latest statistics I could get was from 2017-18, where only 13% of borrowers had actually repaid their loan in full. 65% were still repaying, and 34% had not even started earning enough to repay that yet. And then finally, bills, water, electricity, gas, all snipping away at whatever money is actually left to save, live, and crucially still enjoy life. in 2017, around 11% of households, island households, were in fuel poverty. I don't have any up-to-date statistics on that. And one of the highest levels of 17.2% was in Newport South. So they're just some personal circumstances that sort of play into things. And then our experience of properties themselves on the island, I guess the big one is price. So average house price on the Isle of Wight is around 246,000. Although this is lower than the South East average, so is annual income, with 16 to 29-year-olds earning the least. And as Martha touched on before, my stats were from 2017-18, but of the 360 dwellings, only 18 were affordable, and then the last year, 0, which doesn't help things. And as you said, Martha, the trend is concerning as the gap between what we have and what we actually need is only growing further. There's also concerns about quality of housing. So housing condition has a direct bearing on educational attainment, health and life expectancy. Nationally in 2017, 4.5 million homes failed to meet the decent home standard, and the private rented sector made up a quarter of that number. In my ward of Newport West, a large portion of the housing estate was built in the last 10 years, and in the 6 years we've lived on the island, we've rented, as I said before, 3 different properties, all within that newly built area. And over those years, we've had problems of damp, mould, slight structural damage. And I've spoken to lots of residents in my ward who've had ongoing structural issues. They've had flooding due to faulty plumbing and countless other problems, all in newly built properties, which you shouldn't expect those problems happening in. And then also suitability. So on from the new builds, we've also been looking at sort of older housing. And whilst there's some lovely character in housing on the Isle of Wight, for us in our personal circumstance, it's almost too big a project to take on at the moment. We just haven't got the spare time or the resource at our disposal, and we likely need a pot of cash on top of the deposit just as a safety net for things that could go wrong, or to bring the housing up to scratch in terms of energy efficiency and any repairs that might need making. All the points I've made, which have made saving difficult, they're bad for me, but I don't consider myself in a particularly bad situation. What does upset me, though, is that there are so many younger people and so many other people who are in much worse situations than me and my family. Homelessness applications to the council are on the rise. 4 of the island's 89 LSOAs fall within the 10% most deprived in England, and according to End Child Poverty, 17% of children live in poverty on the Isle of Wight, which shockingly jumps to 34.3% after you take into account housing costs, which doesn't paint a pretty picture, to be honest. But that's my grumble over.
Carrying on. Hopefully I'm going to be a bit positive. I am a Cowstown councillor. I'm really here today just to represent Island Co Housing. Island Co Housing was formed about 18 months ago, and our intention is to build an intentional community. And there's some leaflets on the chairs. Basically, an intentional community is a group of people who want to live together and building a pleasant, sustainable environment. So it's kind of like a small village, I guess, and we're planning to build 20 to 25 housing units. And some of the common themes of most co-housing groups around the world and the ones in Britain are that the main site is pedestrian. So car parking you have at one side of the site or one end of the site. Everybody has their own individual flat or house. There's common space outside, and also one of the things that's really important is to have a common house. And a common house, I guess, is similar to a small village hall, in that you can have a decent sized kitchen, a decent sized hall that you can all meet in and socialise, and then additions to that depending on what your particular needs are. if you put extra bedrooms into the common house, then it means that you need less bedrooms in your own house. So then when you've got kids coming to stay or friends coming to stay, they can use the accommodation in the common house, which means, yeah, each individual property can be a bit smaller. You can have a laundry in there, so you don't need to have a washing machine in every house, so that saves space and also saves on white goods and consuming. We can put some business units into the common house, and one of the things that gels co-housing groups together is eating once or twice or 3 times a week in that common house. And that's what we're hoping to do on the island. At the moment we're looking at 3 sites and we're doing feasibility studies on those 3 sites. As far as I know, there are at least 2 other co-housing groups on the island, one based in Newport, and I think there's one out in West Wight. It meets quite a lot of the needs of you and your family. If we had the money, we would have done it 30 years ago. We home educated our kids, so I worked and Sue did most of the home education, but there was a very big home education support group on the island, and we used to spend a lot of time together, and most of us are in the same place financially, similar to you, and if we could have done it then, we would have done it then, because it's a great way to live, and you provide an informal support network. Yeah, it's just a good way to live. I don't know if anyone's got any questions.
It seems it's very like Johnson Horrocks. We look back or something. He wrote the book 50 Years Ahead, looking back, and very many of the advantages that he had. He included areas to grow vegetables.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very much that was his idea, the way forward.
Yeah, most of the co-housing projects that exist in Britain, or one of the best ones that we went to visit was Lilac in Leeds, which it actually took over, they built on an old primary school site that was inside a suburban area, and they built the housing units, they had a common house, they had a common allotment area, and there was a small area of park that was on the edge of the school site, which they left there, and they share that with the residents, so people can come in and dog walk there, and you can go up and spend time there. But yeah, so some of the common areas, so a common growing area, and also just an area for play or kind of outdoor barbecues or whatever, yeah, quite common themes.
What's the level of national or local support for those sorts of projects? What can you get?
What can you get? I'm not an expert on this, Martha might know. Martin deals with most of the finances for us. We've had 2 local authority grants. The first grant was about 3,000, and that allowed us to set up, so Island Co-Housing is a limited company because that was the quickest and easiest way to form. So we formed that, so that first grant paid for some of the fees for that, solicitors' fees and everything else. And then we also did quite a few site visits, so we went up to Leeds, Lancaster, Stroud, and then we had a second grant from local authority, which we've used to commission an architect to start looking at design and to do feasibility studies on. He's done one on one site, and we've got 2 more sites that he's going to do a feasibility study on. And then we've applied for grants from Homes England, but we were hoping for a decision just before the election, and then we got an email saying that it was kind of in purdah because of the election. And then in January, I don't know if anyone knows, but they said that they'd overspent the grants, so a lot of groups weren't going to get the grants, and we're just waiting at the moment to see if that Homes England money is in the budget for the next financial year or next 5 years. I don't know. So, and there is some money there, and that was money, I think when we looked at it, it was maybe up to about 50,000 per property, which meant that you could put that towards the purchase price of the land. Pardon?
Per unit of the 2025
Yeah.
or per site?
No, per unit, each house. And you can put that towards the purchase price of the land or the building.
And I guess that's cheaper than it would be for them to do the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know? So it's like a subsidy that.
Yeah, and part. I mean, there's paradoxes because we want to build to a very high standard, so very sustainably and very low energy, so that bills will be very, very low for going into the future. We also, one of our cornerstones is that we want to be affordable, and affordability is a bit of a moving target in terms of definition, but the absolute definition is that it's about 80% of market value, so we want to keep that in perpetuity. There's other issues around affordability, because some places it's linked to housing need, and some places it's just a financial cost. And 80% of market value still on the Isle of Wight would still be a lot, but yeah, it's kind of, I guess, as much as we can do. And if we can bring that price down, then any resale will be at 80 or 75% of the market value at the time of resale.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you, Neil.
Oh, sorry. If anybody wants to know anything, there is a web page. So if you want to pick one of these up, you can have a look and see. But there is a web page you can go to find out a bit more.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to talk a little bit about second homes and short-term holiday lets, and really just to raise some awareness of the situation we have on the island. Sometimes when I talk about this, people look a little bit shocked when they start to hear some of the numbers surrounding it. My specific motivation for this is that I'm, in a selfish manner, is that I'm running out of neighbours. I'm literally, the village in which I live in is depopulating. I live in a beautiful place, I live in St Lawrence, and we estimate that around about 30% now of the housing is vacant much of the year. Ventnor itself, I'll come on to, but going beyond Ventnor into Bonchurch, people say it's around about 50% of the housing there is vacant throughout the year. Obviously, this is a localised problems. I mean, I grew up in a fairly dull place in Ryde, and perfectly fine, but quite dull and boring. I'm sure there isn't any holiday lets there. It's very, my mum and dad have a full set of neighbours, but obviously I think in West Wight, in Ventnor, perhaps in the Bay, Bembridge, Seaview, these cows also, okay, sure. These places are gradually emptying out, and as they empty out, that has repercussions into the community as well, for the health and well-being of the people who are remaining there, for the absence of services. It becomes less and less attractive for public transport, for local shops, becomes less attractive for in all manner of ways. So before I carry on, I would like to state that I do very much recognise the value that tourism brings to the island, and I do recognise the certain amount of value that second homes bring to the island as well, because people come, they spend money, they renovate the houses, which puts money into the economy, and then when people come on holiday, they bring money. And Ventnor, for example, has a fantastic restaurant scene that wouldn't exist without the tourists. And you look around any of the towns here, small independent businesses, lots of them wouldn't exist without tourists. But the balance has definitely been lost, and this is a nationwide problem, and we need to look to London to find the answers to this. But just to give a few numbers about the situation on the island. Now, just going from Airbnb alone, there is in the region of 1,400 properties to rent on the island. In where I am, there are around about 200 properties from Ventnor. Now, this is just from Airbnb, and if we had a look, if we were to compile all of the rental properties from Airbnb, from TripAdvisor, from Booking.com, from Holiday Villages, from Isle of Wight Cottages.com, etc., which would be a mammoth task because you'd have to exclude all the double counting. But anecdotally, people think there's around about 300 short-term holiday lets in Ventnor alone. To put that into perspective, there's around about 1,800 properties, not including Upper Ventnor. So who can do the maths there? 15% of housing? So 15% of housing on the short-term market. Added to that, we know that 1 in 6 houses on the island is a second home. So this is a staggering figure. Am I right in saying, Martha, there's 62,000 properties on the island? So we can fairly safely say that around 10,000 properties are second homes. So again, I don't think anybody wants to say that nobody can have a second home, full stop, and nobody wants to say that, you know, we need to get Airbnb and holiday lets off the island. Of course we don't, but we do need to get the balance back.
Yeah, why not, actually? Why not? Why don't we want to attack them?
Why don't we want to attack second homes?
Yeah. Because it is a valid question to ask, why not?
Well, it is a valid question to ask, yeah. And I mean, there is a question about, do we think the state should exercise that much control over everybody's property ownership? In my personal opinion, the state should take a much tougher line, and the number of second homes needs to be dialed down. And there's ways you can do that through taxation and other and disincentives. But the idea that the state should make a blanket ban and say that everybody, you know, you have to live there and you have to live there, for me, I'm uncomfortable with that. But certainly I'm very comfortable with pulling the levers and pushing the buttons and reducing that number greatly. But should we go to the full extent of banning second homes? I don't think that's where we are at this time.
They had recently that programme on Airbnb, and looking at the technicalities that people get away with would actually reduce those numbers greatly, because they had hotels explaining, you know, all fire checks, all health and safety they have to go through before they even open their doors. There was one place saying, before I can actually have a visitor, it's cost me £100,000.
Yes.
Whereas Airbnb can buy a property that was a former hotel, and originally it was about renting out rooms in your house. That was why it was sort of Airbnb. It was a bit of a bed and breakfast kind of scenario in your own primary, you know, residence. But now it's become people just buy out properties and rent them out. They don't have to meet those criteria. And I think if we got tougher on the criteria of non-residential properties that are let out for holiday lettings, and the health and safety and security and all the things that have to be followed, you'd have a lot of people finding it less of an incentive to go down that route, you know, to actually buy, to live, or to let full time or something. Or if you added to the criteria, it must be sort of let out for a certain amount of time per year. You could certainly reduce that percentage.
I agree with you completely, and then that could also lead into a resurgence of bed and breakfasts and hotels, which will provide more sustainable local spending and so on.
Sorry, Stephen. The other thing is, I assume that Airbnb people aren't so easily paying tax as every other hotel. So if they had the state chasing them for tax properly, then that would, you know, if they're not paying tax for whatever reason, that's bad for the whole of society.
Yes.
Because, you know, hospitals aren't being paid for and all the stuff that we all need. But they're having a drain in the community itself as well as a drain on us all.
I agree. I mean, again, I'm not in a position to say that people letting out Airbnbs are not paying their taxes.
No, but they might not be.
But unquestionably, it would be relatively simple to avoid doing this.
You've got the rent a room scheme, so
Yeah.
you know, 7,200, 7,500 now a year that's tax free.
Yes.
Which is technically about renting a room where you live.
Yeah.
But Airbnb can slot into that quite nicely. Nobody checks up on it. If you've got single occupancy of a thing, you get 25% council tax discount. So I don't know how it works if it's your second property, but actually you're letting it out for Airbnb. Who's really checking? That's
right. I mean, we can be pretty sure that the revenue and customs are not going to San Francisco and opening up their database to find out what's going on. So it's very opaque. So, but on the subject of ways in which we can start to reel back this problem with Airbnb becoming so prolific, and it's increasing year on year on year. So, you know, watch this space. There's a number of things you can do. You can introduce a levy. For example, you could put £1.50 a night or £2.50 a night, for example, could go on to that. You can have the taxes the taxes on profits, like you've just mentioned, health and safety regulations, like what hotels have to abide by. You can have duration restrictions. My personal feeling is that if you have a spare room, that spare room can be let 365 days a year, no problem at all. However, if you're letting out a whole place and thereby depriving the community of that potential accommodation, then you can put a restriction on there for 30 days or 60 days. Again, it's a disincentive. It could encourage more properties to go on the long-term market. You can have an annual registration fee, so every year someone has to go along, fill out some forms, pay a certain amount. There's also proximity rules. I know some places around the world you can only have, there has to be a gap, a physical gap between the number of Airbnbs. So, and there's also ways, with the council tax and business rates could be tweaked. So an interesting question. So can anyone guess which city in the world has actually applied most of those restrictions?
Probably London.
San Francisco.
Oh, really?
The home of
makes sense.
Airbnb. So the home of Airbnb actually has some of the toughest rules on Airbnb. Apart from anything else, that they have a 14% taxation on all of their profits straight off the bat. So just very quickly to finish off, just to give you a quick idea again about the context where I am in Ventnor. Right now, I checked just before we started the meeting I checked on Rightmove, which is the bona fide a method by which you can find out what is being rented available for rent on the island. And there's 6 properties at the moment in Ventnor, which is an all-time high actually. I checked a few weeks ago and there was only 2 properties there. But from those 6 properties, 2 of them are short-term lets, that is, they're only available until the holiday season starts again. And then there's 4 others which are proper lets. So again, to put that into perspective, that's about 0.1% of the number of the housing in Ventnor. I'm lucky, I have a house, I'm probably never going to move again. But I just cannot imagine how it must be for people that are in the town and they're coming to the end of their tenancies, people that want to move to the town, people that need to stay in the town. It's a very, very difficult situation. The very last thing I'd like to say actually on this is that in the housing draft strategy that was released some time ago, it did say that the council was prepared to take all steps necessary to improve the housing situation on the island, and yet there wasn't a single mention of short-term lettings, and there was only 1 mention of second homes. So I find it impossible to square that statement that we will leave no stone unturned and the complete absence of trying to address these points. Other local authorities around the country, other cities, Barcelona, Rome, Paris, San Francisco, have taken strong steps. Other local authorities around the country have tried to make steps against to rebalance this situation, but nothing from the Isle of Wight, which I think is a great shame.